are the Danes Israelites of the tribe of Dan. The modern Danish people consists of the Danes on the islands and the Jutes on the Jutland Peninsula. The original Danes, or the proper Danes, came from southern Sweden and are somewhat related to Swedes and Norwegians. The original Jutes, on the other hand, were a Germanic tribe that migrated into the Jutland Peninsula from Germany and were led by a chieftain priest called Odin, and they are somewhat related to Germans and Dutch. This is what the greatest Danish historian of the 18th century, Peter Frederik Suhm, wrote. And Suhm, in turn, based what he wrote on what the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturlasson had written in the 13th century, in the early 13th century. But we can trace the origin of the Danes even further back. Essentially, the Danes on the numerous islands are the Israelite tribe of Dan, and the Jutes on the Jutland Peninsula are of the Israelite tribes of Judah and Dan. The deportation of Israel to areas south of the Caucasus Mountains. As we read in the Old Testament, the 12 tribes of Israel united under King Saul, who was succeeded by King David and King Solomon. But because Solomon had sinned against the God of Israel by building temples to pagan gods, the God of Israel let the 10 northern tribes of Israel secede from King Solomon's son, King Rehoboam, and that happened around the year 931 BC. King Rehoboam's rump state, centered in Jerusalem, contained the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin and was called the Kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of the 10 tribes of Israel, on the other hand, was called the Kingdom of Israel. The kings of the Kingdom of Israel, they continued to promote worship of pagan gods, and therefore the God of Israel punished the 10 tribes of Israel by removing them out of the land of Israel, just as God has told Israel he would do in the book of Deuteronomy. The 3 northern tribes of Israel, which were Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, were among the first of the Israelite tribes to be deported out of the land of Israel, because when the invaders who attacked and deported the Israelite tribes, when they invaded, it was the Assyrians and the Babylonians, when they invaded the land of Israel, they came from the north. So from 734 to 732 BC, King Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria invaded and conquered the northern, eastern, and western parts of the 10-tribed northern kingdom of Israel, as we read about in the Holy Scriptures. We quote from the book of 2 Kings. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maachah, and Janoah, and Kedesh, and Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. Unquote. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29. In the year 724 BC, King Shalmaneser V of Assyria attacked Samaria, which was the capital of the northern 10-tribed kingdom of Israel. And then in 721 BC, his successor, Sargon II, he took Samaria, and the rest of the 10 tribes of Israel were then deported to areas south of the Caucasus Mountains and south of the Caspian Sea, as we again read in the Holy Scriptures, and we again quote from the book of 2 Kings. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Hala and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. Now these areas are almost identical to the areas where the oldest Nordic chronicles, such as Snorri Sturlasson, had stated that the ancestors of the Nordic and Germanic tribes came from before they had migrated across Eastern Europe and into Northern Europe. The Aser V Homeland, south and north of the Caucasus Mountains. The Icelandic chief and historian Snorri Sturlasson, who lived 1179 to 1241, wrote the book Heimskringla approximately 1230, and the first part of Heimskringla is called the Ynglingasaga. And here Snorri Sturlasson describes that the homeland of the Nordic and Germanic tribes was areas south and north of the Caucasus Mountains. They were originally divided into 2 groups or 2 tribes called Aser and Vaner. Now these names are very similar to the names of Asher and Dan, which were 2 of the Israelite tribes which lived in northern Israel when Israel still lived in the land of Israel. For example, when Israel, after the Exodus, wandered in the wilderness, the tribes of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali were organized into the so-called Camp of Dan, as you read about in the book of Numbers, chapter 2. So Snorri Sturlasson describes the homeland of the Vaner tribe, which we identify as the lost Israelite tribe of Dan. And we quote from Snorri Sturlasson's Yndlingssaga, quote, "On the south side of the mountains, which lie outside all inhabited lands," we must assume that this is the Caucasus Mountains, "runs a river through Svidjot." Svidjot was an old Nordic name for Russia. So a river runs through Svidjot, which is probably called by the name of Danes, but was formerly called Tanakvisel or Vanakvisel, and which falls into Black Sea. The river or the people of the Vanakvisel was called Vanerland or Vanheim, and the river separates the three parts of the world, of which the easternmost part is called Asia and the westernmost Europe. Unquote from Snorri Sturlasson's Yndlingssaga, part 1. The river, so-called river called Tanakvisel or Vanakvisel or Tanais, must be the river Don, because its ancient Greek name was Tanais. In the Old Testament, the Danites, they named places after their ancestor Dan, and we read about that in the book of Judges, chapter 18. And the river Don also carries the name of Dan, Don, Dan. Now the Vaner, they lived adjacent to the Aser tribe, and the chief of the Aser tribe, according to Snorri Sturlasson, was a chieftain priest called Odin. And we again quote from the Yndlingssaga. "The country east of the Tanakvisel in Asia was called Aserland or Aserheim, and the chief city in that land was called Asgard. In that city was a chief called Odin, and it was a great place of sacrifice. It was the custom that 12 temple priests should both direct the sacrifices and also judge the people. They were called Dir or Grotner, and all the people served and obeyed them. Odin was a great and very far-traveled warrior who conquered many kingdoms, and so successful was he that in every battle the victory was on his side." Unquote from Snorri Sturlasson's Yndlingssaga, part 2. The lost tribes of Israel's migration from the Middle East to Northern Europe. After a war between the Aser and Vaner, which ended without any of them prevailing, Odin led the tribes to Northern Europe, and we quote from Snorri Sturlasson's Yndlingssaga. "There goes a great mountain barrier from the northeast to southwest, which divides the greater Svidjot from other kingdoms. South of this mountain ridge it is not far to Turkland, where Odin had great possessions. In those times the Roman chiefs went wide around in the world, subduing to themselves all people, and on this account many chiefs fled from their domains. But Odin, having foreknowledge and magic sight, knew that his posterity would come to settle and dwell in the northern half of the world. He therefore set his brothers Sve and Vilja over Asgard, and he himself, with all the gods and a great many other people, wandered out first westward to Gardarrike, which is Russia, and then south to Saxland, which is Saxony in Germany. He had many sons, and after having subdued an extensive kingdom in Saxland, he set his sons to rule the country. He himself went northwards to the sea, or the Baltic Sea, and took up his abode in an island which is called Odin's Island, or Odense, on the island of Funen." Unquote from Snorri Sturlasson's Yndlingssaga, part 5. The account of this migration is confirmed by important Scandinavian historians such as the Danish Peter Frederik Sunde, who lived 1728 to 1798, and the Swedish Olof Rudbeck the Elder, who lived 1630 to 1702. Sunde and Rudbeck did not trace the origins of the Nordic peoples all the way back to the Israelites, but Sunde did write, speaking of the Nordic peoples, that, quote, "the ancestors of us, the Germans and the Celts, lived together in Asia Minor," unquote, from Peter Frederik Sundes book Om Odin og den hedniske gudlære og gudstjeneste i Norden, from 1771. The Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl also confirmed Snorri Sturlasson's account in his 2002 book Jagten på Odin, which means The Search for Odin, wherein Heyerdahl specifically wrote that the ancestors of the Nordic peoples came from Azerbaijan and areas around Azerbaijan. The many Odins. There were probably several Odins. Some writes of at least 3 different Odins. Odin was most likely not a name but rather a title, which meant something like Lord or Chief or Number One or Prime Minister. In Russian, for example, Odin or Odin means one. The Russian name or word for one is Ajin. So Ajin, Odin, Odin, Ajin. I even asked a Russian woman about this, and she confirmed that that is correct. The lost tribes of Israel are divided in 2 groups. When the lost tribes led by Odin came to the Baltic Sea, they divided themselves into 2 groups. One went northward across the Baltic Sea and became the ancestors of the Nordic tribes, such as the Danes and the Swedes and the Geats, which also are part of the modern Swedes, and the Norwegians. The other group went west across what today is Poland and became the ancestors of the Germanic tribes. Sun thus writes that it is, quote, reasonable that our fathers have come here via Russia and the eastern part of Poland. When they came to the Baltic Sea and present-day Livonia, they divided themselves into 2 great multitudes. The one went north, and our fathers descend from them, and the other went west and became the ancestors of many German peoples, unquote, from Peter Frederik Sund's book History of Denmark, Volume 1 from 1782. Denmark called Vanheim. After the tribes had arrived in northern Europe, Vanheim, which was the homeland of the Vaner tribe, was still a geographical place. For example, Sun mentions a certain Swedish king called King Svedgar in the 1st century AD, who went to this country of Vanheim and married a Vaner woman and then continued to Germany, the Greater Svedjord and Gothheim, to search for the older Odin who had been missing for 5 years. And we have that from Sunds book om Odin og den hedenske gudelære gudstjeneste ude i Norden from 1771. And from this context we can see that by Vanheim is meant Denmark, because he travels from Sweden to Vanheim and then to Germany, and between Germany and Sweden is Denmark. The original Danes and Jews. The Gothic historian Jordanes writes in The Origin and Deeds of the Goths from the year 551 AD that the Danes came out of the Swedes. Now it should be noted that the original Swedes and Geats, they later formed Sweden. The reason for this is that the Danes were of the tribe of Dan, and that they came to the Scandinavian peninsula along with the other Israelite tribes at Naphtali, Asher and Gad. These 4 Israelite tribes, they were those who were descended from Jacob Israel's 2 wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. In the Old Testament, they were usually closely associated with each other, and most of their territories in the Holy Land were also next to each other. The original Jews, on the other hand, were of the tribe of Judah, who along with the other Israelite tribes descended from Jacob Israel's first wife Leah, and made up the Germanic tribes that settled on the European continent and the Jutland Peninsula. The origin of the nation of Denmark. Peter Frederik Sund writes that around the year AD 235 there was a certain king Dan Michilati, sometimes spelled Mykilati. So there was this king Dan Michilati who was king of the Danes in Scania and Halland, which is today southern Sweden. But around this time, King Dan Michilati, he was also crowned as king of the islands of Zealand, Funen, Møn, Falster and Lolland, which basically are the rest of the Danish islands. And then when the Jutes and the Angles were invaded by the Saxons, King Dan Michilati successfully helped them, and because of this, The Jutes and the Angles also crowned him as king in Viborg in Jutland, and thus Denmark was united. And Suhn wrote this in History of Denmark from 1782. So what Suhn writes that fits remarkably well with what the respected Danish historian Johannes Brøndsted wrote. Johannes Brøndsted wrote that the ancestors of the Danes arrived to Denmark in two waves from the east. The first shortly after the birth of Christ, and the second in the 3rd century AD. The latter in the 3rd century AD, that is exactly the same time that Suhn writes that this King Mikilati was crowned as the king of the Danes in Scandinavians, in what today is southern Sweden, and on the islands, and in Jutland. The Danes arrived in Denmark in the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Johannes Brøndsted was a capable and respected archaeologist and historian, as well as director of the National Museum of Denmark. Brøndsted wrote this in volume 1 of Politikens Danmarks Historie. Now, Politiken Publishers is one of the largest publishers in Denmark, and they also publish the liberal newspaper Politiken, which is one of the biggest newspapers in the country. Politiken is something like the New York Times of Denmark. As we said, Johannes Brøndsted wrote that the ancestors of the modern Danes migrated into Denmark in two waves. One shortly after the birth of Christ, and another in the 3rd century AD. And that they came from the region north of the Black Sea, and also brought along with them the runic alphabet and the rye grain. Now the rye bread, which of course is made out of rye grain, is the most popular bread in Denmark today. We quote from Johannes Brøndsted. Shortly after the birth of Christ, in other words, in the start of the older Roman era, an immigration must have taken place into Denmark of decidedly long-skulled people of the Nordic type. It must also be assumed that a new immigration of the same type of people, that is, people of the Nordic type, must have taken place in the younger Roman era, probably sometime in the 200s. This way we get a picture, albeit lacking in details, that sometime in the 200s an invasion of Denmark from the east took place. It was a conquest which first subdued Sealand, then eastern Funen, and then the advance stopped, because the attempt to conquer the western parts of the country failed. By chasing out the Heruli tribe in the younger Roman era, the Danes got control of the southern regions of the Nordic countries, which became their future homeland, called Denmark. Jordanes, writing approximately 550, says concerning this place, and he's probably speaking of the Danes, that they claim to be the tallest of all the peoples of Scandinavia. This fits with the anthropological measurings of skeletons from Denmark from the Roman era, which show a rise in the average height of the males. It can therefore not be denied that the thought of the Danes coming to our country sometime in the 200s can find some support both in archaeological and historical sources, even though the latter are both late and scarce. Unquote from Johannes Brøndsted, Politikens Danmarks Historie, Volume 1, from 1977. Jutes invade England. Even though the Jutes had become a part of Denmark under King Mikilati approximately 235 AD, Jutland remained the apple of discord between Danes and Saxons, and to such an extent that the Jews often were reckoned as belonging to the Saxons rather than the Danes. Suhn also writes that in History of Denmark from 1782. Then in the 5th century AD, when the earth in Jutland was exhausted and could not support the population, the Jutes invaded England along with the Angles and Saxons. But in these invasions are not mentioned any Danes. The Danes and the Norwegians only invaded the British Isles in the later Viking era, from the 8th to 11th centuries. The name Denmark or Danmark. Denmark, which is the Danish name for Denmark, means the Danes' borderland, because mark is an old word for borderland. Denmark or Danmark was originally the name for Mikilati's kingdom in Skåne and Halland, what today is southern Sweden, but eventually it became the name for the entire kingdom. The Danish historiographer Ivar Nielsen Hertzon, who lived in the 17th century in a town pretty close to me, he wrote that the Danes and Denmark's name comes from, quote, the Hebrew name Dan, meaning to judge, investigate, and believes that we are called so because of our wisdom, unquote. And I have that from Peter Frederik Suhns book, Kritisk Historie af Danmark from 1774. So this historiographer, Ivar Hertzon, he did not write specifically that the Danes descended from the Israelite tribe of Dan. He did not write it, and he did not write that they did not, but he only writes that the name of the Danes and Denmark, it does come from the Israelite tribe of Dan. And whether Ivar Hertzon did believe that the Danes descended from the Israelite tribe of Dan, I do not know. Now, in the days of the Old Testament, the tribe of Dan had a habit of naming places after their father Dan, the son of Israel. The tribe of Dan originally lived in a territory in southwestern Israel next to the tribes of Ephraim and Benjamin and Judah, and also next to the Philistines. But then in the early 12th century, 600 Danites, they sought a new territory in the north of the land of Israel, next to the Phoenicians, and also next to the tribes of Naphtali and the half-tribe of Manasseh in Bashan. And on their way, when they migrated there, they camped in a place in Judah, which the Danites called Mahanadan, which means the camp of Dan. We read about that in the book of Judges. We quote, "And there went from thence of the family of the Danites, out of Zorah and out of Eshtaol, 600 men appointed with weapons of war. And they went up and pitched in Kiriath Jearim in Judah, wherefore they called that place Mahanadan unto this day. Behold, it is behind Kiriath Jearim," unquote. The book of Judges, chapter 18, verses 11 to 12. After they had smitten the peaceful Phoenicians of Laish with the sword and burned the city, they called the city Dan. And we again quote from the book of Judges. "And they built a city and dwelt therein. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born unto Israel. Howbeit, the name of the city was Laish at the first," unquote. Judges chapter 18, verses 28 to 29. When the tribe of Dan, now called Vaner or Taner, when they migrated across Eastern Europe, they likewise seem to have named several major rivers after themselves. The river Don, by the ancient Norsemen called Tanakvisl or Vanakvisl, and by the ancient Greeks called Tanais, has already been mentioned. Other major Eastern European rivers also start with a prefix dn, such as the Donets, which is a tributary to the river Don, and the Dnieper, which by the late Greek and Roman authors also was called Danapris and Danaper. And then we have the Dniester River, which by the Romans and Jordanus was called the Danastris and Danastus. And then we have the river Danube, which in German and Danish and other languages is called Donau. In the year 1219, King Valdemar II of Denmark led a successful crusade in Estonia to convert the Estonians to the Christian faith. Besides King Valdemar and the Danish army, the Crusaders also included Archbishop Sunesen of Denmark, Bishop Theodoric of Estonia, a German army, and a Slavonic sword army. The Crusaders encamped at Lyndanisse and began to build a castle which they called Dane Castle, or in Latin Castrum Danorum, which became the city of Tallinn, which in Estonian means Dane City or City of the Danes, and today is the capital of Estonia. It was at the Battle of Lyndanisse that a flag, which probably had belonged to some of the Crusaders and somehow had gotten hurled up into the air, that this flag fell down from the sky and became the Dannebrog, which is the modern Danish flag. And by the way, this photo is from Tallinn in Estonia, where they commemorate the site of the Battle of Lyndanisse, where the Danish flag fell down from the sky. I was there in 2011. Today, Danes Danes likewise have a habit of using the name Dan in their firms, for example, in their companies. If you type in Dan in the Danish online yellow pages, you can see a long list of firms and companies such as Dan Tex, they make cable tubes and other tubes. Then we have Dan Ejendomme, they rent out apartments. Then we have Dan Glass. There are several firms by this name, and they make car windows, glass. Dan Tech, they thatch roofs with straws, that is. Then we have a company called Rotterdam, and they make different kinds of wheels. Then we have Dan Color, they produce different kinds of paints. Then we have Dan Dryer, they produce dryers for bathrooms. Then we have Dan Markering, they make road signs and other forms of road markings. Then we have Dan Trailers, they make trailers for cars such as the one on the picture. Then we have Dan Elektron, they produce lightning conductors. Then there's a company called Nordan Bus, that's a Norwegian-Danish bus company. Then there's Dan Cargo, they are a leading Nordic firm within international transport and third-party logistics. Then there's Dan Cool, they make vehicles with refrigerators and freezers for butchers, for example. Then there's Dan Labels, they make labels. Then we have Dan Stål, there's also numerous companies by this name, and they make products with steel and other metals. Then we have Advodan, that's a company of advocates or lawyers or barristers. Then we have Babydan, they develop and produce and sell safety equipment for babies and small children. Then we have Dan Autoparts, and they sell parts for automobiles. Then there's Dan Foss, that's a very big company. They make thermostats for radiators and other products. Then there's Dan Group Alarm, and they set up alarms. The tribe of Dan and ships. According to the Bible, the tribe of Dan has a close relationship with water and ships. Approximately 1285 BC, when the Israelites were living under a Canaanite occupation army, Barak and Deborah led a successful revolt against the Canaanites. But some of the Israelite tribes chose not to be a part of this rebellion. Because of this, Deborah and Barak complained about those Israelite tribes and said concerning the tribe of Dan, we quote from the book of Judges, "Why did Dan remain in ships?" Unquote. Judges chapter 5 verse 17. At this point in time, the tribe of Dan lived in the southwestern part of the land of Israel in what modern Israeli Jews call Gush Dan, meaning the block of Dan, which is around Tel Aviv, where approximately 44 of modern Israeli Jews live. Later, the majority of the tribe of Dan migrated to the northern part of the land of Israel on the border to modern Lebanon, which we read about in the book of Judges, chapters 17 to 18. This was on the border to the Phoenicians, which were a Canaanite people with whom the Israelites had a good relationship. The Phoenician king of Tyre, for example, helped in supplying cedar wood for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Then later in the 8th century BC, when the Assyrians first threatened and later invaded Israel, the Danites were probably the first to flee by seeking hire on Phoenician ships, since that was an easy way of escaping. In the Bible, we therefore see that the tribe of Dan has a close relationship with water and ships. And this is fulfilled in the modern Danes, who across the world are famous for being descendants of the Vikings, whose raids and exploits took place on Viking ships, which happen to look remarkably a lot like the ships of the Phoenicians. Deborah and Barak's prophecy about the tribe of Dan's relationship with ships is also fulfilled in modern Denmark, where the by far largest Danish company is the shipping company A.P. Møller Mærsk, which is the second largest shipping company in the world. It's only surpassed by the Swiss-Italian MSC company, Actually, Maersk was the largest shipping company in the world until January 2022. It was only then that MSC overtook Maersk's position as the world's largest shipping company. Maersk's position as Denmark's largest and most important business is also symbolized in the fact that Maersk's headquarters in Copenhagen is situated just north of Amalienborg Palace, which is the primary residence of the Danish king. And also in the fact that Maersk has paid for the construction of the Copenhagen Opera House, which is situated symmetrically across Copenhagen Harbour from Amalienborg Palace. Here in this photo we can see in the foreground the big four buildings. That's Amalienborg Palace, where the king and queen live. And then right across the harbour, that's Copenhagen Opera House. And by the way, this is recorded on January 17, 2024. And just 3 days ago, on January 14th, Denmark got a new king. It was because Queen Margrethe II, she abdicated, and then she has been succeeded by her son, who is now King Frederik X. Conclusion. There are so many historical and biblical connections between the modern Danish people and the Israelite tribe of Dan that the modern Danish people must be Danites. I have made other videos on this subject that where I speak more about this in more detail. And also other people have also written about this subject and also made videos about it. But they also give many more details. And the first one to do so, and who's still widely remembered today, that must be Colonel John Cox-Scholar, who in 1880 wrote this book, Dan, the Pioneer of Israel. And that's still a classic on the subject today. And John Cox-Scholar, he was not just anybody, he was in fact the official keeper of the British crown jewels at the Tower of London. The crown jewels of Queen Victoria, well, today that must be King Charles III. And this book, it was also translated into Danish in 1993 by a couple in Næstved on southern Zealand. The Danish translation of this is really hard to get, but the English version, that's easy to get, fortunately. So I hope that you have appreciated this video, and if you did, you are welcome to give it a like or make a comment.